At Thanksgiving dinner, my mom raised her glass and said, "Let's toast to the only child who actually made us proud." Everyone turned to my sister and clapped. My chair wasn't even set at the table. I stood up, took a deep breath, and said, "Thanks for finally saying it out loud." I walked toward the door, but stopped cold when my dad started panicking. I, 32M, had always known where I stood in my family, but hearing it said out loud at Thanksgiving dinner was like getting punched in the gut by someone you trusted. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was watching everyone nod along like they'd been waiting years for someone to finally say it. I'd driven 3 hours to get there, just like every year since college. Just like every year, I walked into that house hoping things might be different. The smell of turkey and stuffing should have felt welcoming, but instead it reminded me of every holiday where I sat at the kids' table long after I'd outgrown it. Every Christmas morning where my sister's pile of presents dwarfed mine. Every birthday where the celebration felt like an afterthought. My sister had arrived the day before with her husband and 2 kids. She'd been the golden child since birth, valedictorian, full scholarship to an Ivy League school, married a doctor, gave them the grandchildren they'd always wanted. I was the accident that came 5 years later, the one who struggled through community college, the one who worked in IT instead of having a real career, the one who was still single at 32 because apparently I hadn't figured out how to be lovable. When I walked into the dining room, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The table was set for 8 people, but there were 9 of us. I counted again. My parents, my sister and her family of 4, my uncle who always came alone, and me. 9 people, 8 place settings. I asked Mom where I was supposed to sit, trying to keep my voice light. She looked flustered for a moment, then suggested I could grab a chair from the kitchen and squeeze in somewhere. My sister was already seated at what used to be my usual spot, bouncing her youngest on her lap, while her husband carved the turkey like he owned the place. The kitchen chair I brought over didn't match the dining set. It was lower, wobblier, and made me feel like I was 12 years old again, begging to sit with the adults. But I squeezed in between my uncle and the wall, my knees bumping against the table leg every time I tried to adjust. Dinner conversation flowed around me like I wasn't there. My sister talked about her promotion at the law firm. Her husband discussed his latest research publication, and my parents hung on every word. When my uncle asked what I'd been up to, I mentioned the promotion I'd gotten at work, team lead for our biggest client's account, something I'd been working toward for 2 years. Dad nodded absently and immediately steered the conversation back to my sister's recent case win. Mom chimed in about how proud they were, how she'd always known she was destined for greatness. I sat there pushing stuffing around my plate, wondering why I kept coming back to this. The moment that changed everything came during dessert. Mom stood up with her wine glass, her cheeks flushed from the bottle they'd opened earlier. She cleared her throat and announced she wanted to make a toast. My sister looked pleased but surprised, probably thinking it was sweet but unnecessary. Then Mom raised her glass higher and delivered the words that would replay in my head for months afterward. She wanted to toast to the only child who had actually made them proud, she said. Her voice was warm and full of genuine affection as she looked directly at my sister. The room erupted in applause. My uncle clapped enthusiastically, my brother-in-law raised his own glass with a proud smile, and even the kids joined in because everyone else was doing it. My sister blushed and protested that it wasn't necessary, but she was glowing from the attention. I sat there with my hands in my lap, feeling like I'd been erased from existence. Not just ignored or overlooked, completely eliminated. The empty chair I wasn't given suddenly made perfect sense. I was the mistake they'd been trying to correct for 32 years. Something snapped inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I stood up slowly, feeling everyone's eyes on me for the first time all evening. The clapping died down as they waited to see what I was going to do. I thanked Mom for finally saying what we'd all been thinking for years. My voice was steady, almost conversational, which seemed to unnerve everyone more than if I'd started yelling. I told them it was actually refreshing to have the truth out in the open instead of pretending we were some happy, functional family. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister's face went white, and she started to say something about how Mom didn't mean it that way. But I cut her off gently, telling her she didn't need to make excuses. We all knew exactly what Mom meant. I walked toward the front door, grabbing my jacket from the coat closet. This was it. The moment I'd been building toward my entire life without realizing it. I was finally going to stop subjecting myself to their indifference and disappointment. But then Dad's voice stopped me cold. He wasn't speaking to me. He was frantically whispering to Mom in the dining room, but his voice carried. He was asking her if she remembered what I'd told them last Christmas about the life insurance policy through my work. The one where I'd listed them as beneficiaries because I didn't have anyone else. My blood ran cold. Last December, I'd mentioned in passing that my company's life insurance policy had increased, and since I wasn't married or didn't have kids, I kept my parents as the beneficiaries. It seemed like the responsible thing to do at the time. Dad had asked a lot of questions about the payout amount, which policies were involved, whether it was tied to my employment. Now I understood why he'd been so interested, and why they'd continued inviting me to family gatherings despite clearly not wanting me there. I heard Mom shushing him, but the damage was done. My sister was asking what they were talking about, and my uncle was looking confused. The kids were getting restless, sensing the adult tension but not understanding it. I walked back into the dining room and asked Dad directly what he was worried about. The question hung in the air like smoke. He stammered something about just wanting to make sure I was okay, that maybe we'd all had too much wine and should talk about this later. But I pressed him. I asked if he was concerned about what would happen to that life insurance money if I decided to change the beneficiaries. If maybe that was why they'd been tolerating my presence at family gatherings all these years. The look that passed between my parents told me everything I needed to know. My sister was staring at them in horror, finally starting to piece together what had been happening. My uncle set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, watching the family drama unfold like it was a movie. I told them I had some thinking to do about a lot of things. The life insurance beneficiaries were just the beginning. There was also the matter of the loan I'd given them 3 years ago to help with their mortgage refinancing. Money they'd never mentioned paying back. The down payment I'd contributed for their new car last year, presented as a family gift that apparently only went one direction. Dad started backpedaling frantically, saying I was misunderstanding everything. Mom jumped in, claiming she'd misspoken with the toast, that she was proud of both her children. But her words sounded hollow and desperate now, like she was reading from a script. I asked them a simple question. If I hadn't told them about the insurance money, would I have been invited to Thanksgiving dinner at all? The silence stretched on until it became an answer in itself. My sister finally spoke up, asking our parents if this was really why they'd been including me in family events. She looked genuinely shaken, like she was seeing them clearly for the first time. Her husband was staring at his plate, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. That's when I realized something that changed everything. My sister hadn't known. All these years, I'd assumed she was part of the favoritism, that she'd been consciously participating in my exclusion. But she looked as shocked as I felt. She genuinely believed our parents loved us equally, that my treatment was just coincidental or imagined. I told her I was sorry she had to find out this way. She deserved to keep believing in the version of our parents she'd grown up with. But I couldn't pretend anymore. Mom started crying then, begging me not to leave angry. She insisted she loved me, that I was important to the family. But when I asked her to name one specific thing she was proud of about me, one accomplishment, one quality, one moment where she'd felt genuine pride, she couldn't answer. Dad tried a different approach, getting angry and accusing me of being dramatic and oversensitive. He said I was ruining Thanksgiving over a misunderstanding, that I should be grateful for everything they'd done for me over the years. When I asked him to name one thing they'd done for me that they hadn't done twice as much for my sister, he started listing things like fed you and put a roof over your head, basic parental obligations he was treating like generous gifts. The absurdity of it all hit me then. Here I was, a grown man arguing with his parents about whether they loved him, while my sister's children watched from their high chairs. This was what I'd been subjecting myself to for decades, begging for scraps of affection from people who saw me as a burden and a backup plan. I looked at my sister and told her I hoped she'd have a better relationship with her own kids, that she'd find room in her heart for both of them, even if one turned out different from what she expected. She nodded with tears in her eyes. Then I walked out. For real this time. Update 1. The call started the next morning. First Mom, then Dad, then my sister. I let them all go to voicemail initially, needing time to process what had happened. When I finally listened to the messages, the pattern was predictable. Mom's message was full of tears and apologies, saying she'd never meant to hurt me and begging me to come back so we could talk. Dad's was more defensive, claiming I'd overreacted and demanding I call him back immediately to sort this out like adults. My sister's was different. She sounded genuinely devastated and said we needed to have a real conversation about our family. I decided to call my sister back first. She answered on the second ring and immediately started apologizing for not seeing what had been happening. She said she'd been thinking all night about family dinners and holidays, trying to remember if I'd always been treated differently, and now she couldn't unsee it. She told me about a conversation she'd had with her husband after I left. He'd mentioned that he'd always wondered why our parents seemed so much more interested in their family than in me, but he'd assumed it was because I was single and didn't have kids. Now he was asking her if maybe there was more to it. I told her I appreciated her calling, but this wasn't about her. She'd been a kid when most of this pattern started, and she couldn't have been expected to see it or stop it. The problem was with our parents, not with her. But she surprised me by saying she wanted to understand how bad it had been. She asked me to tell her specific examples, things she might have missed or forgotten. So I did. I told her about the time in high school when I made the honor roll for the first time, and Mom's reaction was to ask if I was sure they hadn't made a mistake. About how they'd attended every single one of her soccer games, but missed my graduation from community college because they had a dinner party that night. About how they'd helped her with a down payment on her first house, but told me I needed to learn financial responsibility when I asked for help with my car loan. The more I talked, the quieter she got. Finally, she said she remembered some of those things, but had always found explanations for them. She thought they were harder on me because I was the boy, or because I was younger, or because they had higher expectations for me. She'd never considered that they simply cared less. She asked what I was going to do about the life insurance. I told her I honestly didn't know. Part of me wanted to change the beneficiaries immediately, just to make a point. But another part of me realized that would be making decisions based on anger, and I needed time to think clearly. By the end of the call, she was crying again. She said she felt terrible about all the years she'd enjoyed being the favorite without questioning why I wasn't getting the same treatment. I told her that wasn't her fault. She'd been a child receiving love from her parents, which was exactly what should have happened. The problem was that they'd only had enough love for one of us. Update 2. Dad showed up at my apartment the following Tuesday. I wasn't expecting him, and seeing him standing in my doorway felt surreal. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow. He asked if we could talk, and despite everything, I let him in. He started with the life insurance, which told me everything about his priorities. He wanted to know if I was planning to change the beneficiaries, and when I said I was considering it, he got agitated. He started talking about how they'd been counting on that money for their retirement, how they'd made financial decisions based on knowing it would be there. I asked him to listen to what he was saying. He was upset about potentially losing money from my death, not about the possibility that I might cut them out of my life while I was alive. The irony wasn't lost on me. He tried to backtrack, saying of course he cared about our relationship, but the life insurance conversation had made him realize how much tension there was in the family. He wanted to fix things, he said. I asked him the same question I'd asked Mom. To name one thing he was genuinely proud of about me. He thought for a long moment, then mentioned my job stability and how I'd never gotten into serious trouble, damning with faint praise, but at least it was something. Then I asked him why he thought I'd kept them as beneficiaries in the first place. He said he'd assumed it was because family was important to me. I told him he was right. Family had been the most important thing to me for 32 years. That's why it had taken me so long to admit that the feeling wasn't mutual. He got defensive again, insisting that they loved me just as much as my sister. When I asked why that love looked so different in practice, he couldn't answer. He fell back on the old explanations, that they'd treated us differently because we were different people with different needs. I told him that different treatment was fine, but different levels of care and respect weren't. I pointed out that he'd never once asked about my promotion at work, but he could recite every detail of my sister's latest case. He'd never visited my apartment before today, but he'd helped paint my sister's house last summer. The conversation went in circles for an hour. He alternated between apologizing and defending their actions, never quite admitting that there was a real problem, but also never convincing me that things would change. Finally, I told him I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, we were going to have going forward. He asked again about the life insurance before he left. I told him I'd make whatever decision felt right to me, and that decision wouldn't be based on what was financially convenient for them. The look on his face told me that wasn't the answer he'd hoped for. Update 3. 3 weeks later, I made my decision. I changed the life insurance beneficiaries to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. It felt like the right way to honor the person I'd become despite my family, not because of them. I didn't tell them immediately. Instead, I used that time to really think about what I wanted my life to look like. I realized I'd been holding myself back in a lot of ways, making decisions based on what would make my parents proud instead of what would make me happy. I started dating someone I'd met through work, a woman I'd been interested in for months but hadn't pursued because I was too caught up in feeling unworthy of love. I signed up for the coding boot camp I'd been researching for years, finally ready to make the career change I'd been putting off. I even started seeing a therapist to work through the family issues that had been weighing me down. My sister and I had dinner the week before Christmas. She'd been calling regularly since Thanksgiving, trying to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground. She told me she'd been having her own difficult conversations with our parents, asking them directly about their different treatment of us. According to her, they were still mostly in denial, but cracks were showing. Mom had admitted that she'd always found it easier to relate to my sister, and Dad had acknowledged that they'd had higher expectations for her from the beginning. They weren't ready to admit they'd been unfair, but they were starting to see that I had reasons to be hurt. She asked if I'd consider joining them for Christmas, saying she'd make sure I had a proper place at the table and that the conversation stayed civil. I appreciated the offer, but I told her I wasn't ready. I was still figuring out who I was without the weight of their disappointment, and I needed more time. Instead, I spent Christmas with my girlfriend's family. They welcomed me warmly, asked genuine questions about my life, and treated me like someone worth knowing. It was the best holiday I'd had in years. On New Year's Eve, I finally called my parents. I told them I'd changed the life insurance beneficiaries and that I wouldn't be coming to family gatherings for the foreseeable future. Mom cried, Dad got angry, but I stayed calm. I told them that if they ever genuinely wanted a relationship with me, not my money or my sense of family obligation, but actually me, they knew how to reach me. I also told them I hoped they'd learn to see my sister as a whole person, not just a trophy for their successful parenting. She deserved parents who loved her for who she was, not just for what she'd accomplished. The conversation was shorter than I'd expected. There wasn't much left to say. It's been 6 months now, and I'm doing better than I have in years. My career is taking off, my relationship is solid, and I've built a chosen family of friends who actually care about me. My sister and I talk regularly, and she's been working on setting better boundaries with our parents too. I still sometimes wonder if I'll regret cutting them off so completely. But then I remember that Thanksgiving dinner, sitting in a mismatched chair while they toasted to their only worthwhile child, and I know I made the right choice. Some families are worth fighting for. Others, you're better off without.